So first of all, I can't thank you folks enough for having me here, and thanks to Andrea for kicking this thing off and recommending. By the way, I get to work with one of the best teams in the industry at Baruch College, the Cassidy there, so cheers to them. So one of the challenges that I face as an educator, and I've been doing this over 20 years in continuing studies, is I'm constantly dealing with people who are terrified. And those of you who have been in continuing studies probably understand exactly what I'm saying, in that there's so many times when you sit down in front of a room full of adults, and they're still living through the trauma of their secondary education somewhere. And I get questions like, do we need to know this for a test? And my thought is always, well, you actually need to know this because it's important information. But a lot of times people start worrying about the evaluation process. What do we need to know? How are we going to be evaluated on this? What does this mean for my future? Will this go on my permanent record? So things like that. So we need to think really about what it is the needs of our clients, if you will, and how we can provide them with the skill sets that they need. So when Fern and George approached me several months back and said, hey, would you be willing to do a keynote? And here's the topic areas. I was thinking, okay, well, what we're looking at is a world that's changing very dramatically. And it's changing a lot faster than the educational processes are changing. So what can we do to stay ahead of it? What can we do to make sure that the skill sets that we're offering students are actually in line with what the marketplace wants? And so really the crux of what I wanted to talk about today is really that. Is the idea of, are we still providing a valuable solution to people who need to take this information and apply it in some meaningful way as they go out into the real world? And if we're not, what can we do to fix things up and make sure that education is heading in the right direction? Now these are obviously a pretty heavy question. And the challenge that we have, I think, is that we start to look at, well, that's me, we start to look at what really are we trying to accomplish? And I thought about this for many years because, I don't know, anybody else here get involved in education totally accidentally? Show of hands. Okay. A bunch of you. Okay, see, I'm not the only one. And somebody said, hey, can you come in and talk to somebody about this? And I said, sure, I'd love to come in and talk about it. And then I said, can you come in and like teach classes on what you came in to talk about? And I said, well, I'm kind of running a business and all, but sure, I'd love to do that on the side because won't that be fun? And in a lot of ways it has been, but in a lot of ways it's also a little bit more addicting because you realize that you're put in a position where you can make a difference in somebody else's lives. By the way, show of hands, how many of you work in continuing education because that's where the big bucks are? All right, just for the record, runner, no hand, okay, one hand. And that's a matter of perspective. So a lot of times we get into education because we really want to make a difference. There's a genuine desire to help other people. And so when I think about what I do every single day, and by the way, I work in training when I'm not educating people, is my job is to empower others. So I really kind of created a mission statement that's just 2 words for myself. My job is to empower others. And so what does that mean? What can I do to empower other people? Well, in a lot of ways, when we're looking at a marketplace, we need to think about what it is the people that we're providing understanding to, insights, knowledge, what are they doing with that information? What are they expected to do with that information? What do they think they're going to get? Now, we're also in a business. We're in a business where people say, here, we're going to give you some money in exchange for money. You're going to give me understanding that I can take with me and go do something with, right? And in most cases, people have a career thought. They have a job. They need to retool themselves. They need to be in a position where they feel that what they're learning is going to help them do a better job. And basically that means make more money in the future. That's really what people are coming in. So it's an investment in myself. How can I be more effective in my career if I go and do these things? So I started thinking about the future. How many of you remember this book from 1970? Okay, so those of you who I would recommend to my cohorts. What Alvin Toffler was talking about with Future Shock was the idea that the world is going to change to a point where what currently works is not going to work anymore. And then we have to think about what the next stage is. Now, one of the things that really kicked out to me, and I thought of this when I was putting the content together, having run across this quote many years ago, he says, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I said, wow, I think that's so dead on. That's what we're dealing with. How many of you have learned lots of things or gotten really good at something and then had to kind of forget it so you can move on to something else? Anybody? okay? And it happens all the time. The idea like I'm going to master this and I'm going to be the master of this for the rest of my life really doesn't exist anymore. Everything is constantly changing, from the technology we use, the platforms we use. I did software development for a dozen years. Trust me, everything's constantly changing. So you have to stay on top of it. And the way Toffler defined future shock was too much change in too short a period of time. And a lot of it has to do with our levels of comfort. But it also has to do with economies. It has to do with what we can do as these things change. Now, he was looking at it from a completely different perspective, from an educational perspective. He said, okay, we've gone from an agrarian society to an industrial society. So agrarian is pretty much pre-1900 somewhere. Most people worked in the farming business. It was about food and agriculture. It was a sustainable business. And then when the Industrial Revolution happened, a lot of people were able to leave the farms and go to work in the cities. They had places they could live, they could make money, it wasn't just sustenance living, and it really changed the overall fabric of our society. But what Toffler's saying is we're looking at some point at a post-industrial point in our history. Now remember, he wrote this in 1970, and he defined this as basically a point in history when no more than 15% of the population are employed in agriculture, and that the service providers out there are going to be more than 50% of all the jobs out there. Well, I did a little digging, see if we're at post-industrial yet. And by the way, he was referring to the services as being brain work. It's about brain work, not necessarily physical labor that's going to change the fabric of society here. Well, farming today is done by 2% of the population, and on the services side of things, approximately 81% of people are involved in services. So yeah, we have reached post-industrial, and future shock is very real for a lot of people. So we have to think about how do we stay competitive in a world that's changing, but for the people who have been living in this idea of a manufacturing society or an industrial society in some way, how do we get them to think differently, and how do we provide them with the tools and understanding they need to evolve forward to get to another place? So, and by the way, in my opinion, a lot of the education that I've seen, not only from the academic pulpit, but also watching my children grow up, has not really fulfilled this promise. When we talk about education, it's really been this kind of unwritten contract that we're going to give you a better quality of life. You get educated, you have more opportunity. You get an education, you have a better house to live in. You have cars that work. You have, opportunities, you go on vacations, whatever it is that education buys you in the future. So I invest my time, I invest my money, and I make sure I do it right, because in the future it's going to make a huge difference as to how I turn out and what opportunities are afforded me. Well, it's not a bad thing to think about. And as educators, we bought into the other side of it. That's our job. Our job is to provide people with those skills so they can live a better life. And it works to a certain degree. But one of the challenges, of course, is that we run into points in history, like now, where we have jobs that cannot be filled because the people we need to fill them don't exist yet. So, for example, this is from earlier this year. By the way, the United States is the #1 country in the world with the most unfilled jobs. So we hear about bad economies. Oh, the economy's so bad, no one can find a job. We have so many jobs that go unfilled because the skills to fill them don't exist. And so we start looking at what is referred to as the $1 trillion a year problem, in that we're losing this money because there's nobody to do the work. So we can't be competitive in a lot of these areas, especially in the new technologies, because the people who need to do the jobs don't exist. They haven't learned what's needed. So that's one of the things we could certainly look at. I spent way too much time on the subway, but I actually shot this the other day because I was thinking, here you go, career for the future. You have a choice between a fitness trainer or a medical assistant. So if this fits your need, great. You've narrowed it down and slammed up. Awesome. Okay? And you get to look like this dude. So that's an added plus. But the reality of what most of us are looking at is that that's not the path we're on. We don't necessarily want to say, well, here's 2 opportunities I could look at. So what does the future hold for us? What does it look like to be someone working in the future? And so I had to really think about the future, and you start off in abstract terms, but you start to think about what does it look like? What does 2020 look like for someone graduating from college? What opportunities are out there? What jobs are available for them? What's no longer around? We have to think about this paradigm shift, because as new economies are being created, older economies are being put away. What does this mean? Well, in order to get us there. I thought we should slaughter a few sacred cows. So here's a sacred cow. We'll just slaughter it this way, cleanly. And what I want to share with you is my thoughts on the educational system that got us here is not going to get us there. So what does this mean? How do we change our thinking surrounding this education, and what is this going to do for us? Well, several years ago, Seth Godin wrote an interesting book called Linchpin. And he really talks a lot about the educational process. And of course, this idea, a lot of us would like to believe, at least in our current incarnations, that we're rather indispensable. We're good people, we do a good job, we're nice to work with. But a lot of times, we also have to come to terms with the fact that what we're doing is maybe not that unique. We might be cogs in a big machine. In a lot of ways, our education prepared us for this. And what Godin talks about in this book is the fact that the educational processes that got us here, which were based upon the British educational system, were designed for agricultural and for an industrial society. So 300 years of making sure that we all had the same parts. Okay? Learn this, learn this, learn this. So a student growing up in Australia could be plucked from that culture and very easily put into a social situation in Canada because the educational systems are on par. Okay? So a lot of the places around the world where the British ruled were basically standardized, which is fantastic. What you need is someone to work in a factory. But we don't work in factories anymore, at least not many of us. And instead, we're in a position where so many of us are doing so many very different things, which are kind of a wide spectrum. It's not like, okay, you're going to work in this factory doing this, or you're going to be a manager doing this, etc. It's a much more detailed process, as you already know. In 1954, Encyclopedia Britannica released the Great Books. How many of you have ever heard of the Great Books? I had a collection of them bestowed upon me by my parents when they no longer wanted them, and I stored them very happily for about 10 years without reading a single one of them. But the idea behind the Great Books when they were published is that if you had read the Great Books, you would be learned. You would be one of these people who knew just about absolutely everything there was to know about everything. Which sounds really kind of, heady. It's nice if I wanted to be an intellectual snob and say, yes, I read the Great Books. And let me tell you what Plato meant when he talked about the allegory of the cave. But unfortunately, I was way too lazy to actually open the book up and find out what Plato was talking about. But what they published it was to really help fill the gaps of understanding and knowledge that people had with their formal education, especially people working in business. That was their marketing tool. Let's get this in front of business people so they can sit down and talk about Euclidean geometry and other things that most of us have no idea about. But the problem with this model, then I would guess, as in now, is that we no longer live in a world where we have to memorize everything. Once upon a time, that was it. Let's go into school and let's memorize. And let's memorize and let's memorize some more. And our book, Mr. Fuller, pointed out, actually quite a few years ago, that until 1900, human knowledge, as was being recorded, was doubling approximately every 100 years. Okay? And now by 1945, that knowledge was doubling every 25 years. And today, we're looking at knowledge doubling about every 13 months. If you wanted to be the smartest person in the world and not know absolutely everything, you can't. You can't fit it in. You don't have the bandwidth to be that smart. The good news is you don't need to know everything. You need to know the things you need to know, which opens up another can we need to think about. What should I learn for me? What's for me? And so we're entering this age where the idea of learning absolutely everything and knowing absolutely everything and memorizing things and having all this information in our heads is giving way to the fact that we can really start to focus on very specific things. I have a friend who is a marine biologist, and by the time she got to earning her degree, all of the good animals were taken. Everyone had already written their theses on all sorts of things so she ended up with some sort of slime mold that grew underwater and would spend hours counting plankton and things like that. But she became the foremost authority on that according to plankton, etc. So we started to specialize and subspecialize with a lot of the learning that we have and what we need. And this idea that's very interesting now is that even with that approach, what we're starting to see is the idea of being a jack of all trades is one of the best things that we can do. So there's this weird change of go learn, be specialized. Oh, by the way, it helps if you know a little bit about absolutely everything. So how do we get this out there? How do we make this happen when we're dealing with adult learners? We need to think about what the needs are going to be in the future. No, I just sat down and I was saying, all right, let me just quickly think about all of the different platforms that I've had to develop media in. So I started around 1989, God, I'm old. But I started with HyperCard, and then I moved on to SuperCard, and then I started using something called VideoWorks, which turned into Director, and then I was using Flash, and then Dreamweaver, and Joomla, and Moodle, and HTML5, and WordPress. And last week I was working on Thinkific. And you're constantly dumping this stuff out of your head. By the way, I worked on Director for 10 years. I was a master. I could program in this thing. I could do whatever you needed done. Now, if you sat me down in front of a computer, opened up the software, and said go to it, I would have absolutely no idea how to get started. Okay? You have to flush it sometimes. Just lose it out of your head. So when we think about our own educations, we have to think about the needs of the marketplace. If I'm going through this evolution with just the little things of my little part of the world, what are other people going through? What is it they're not learning that they need to learn? So we need to think about these subspecialties. We need to think about emerging markets and what that's going to mean for the need for knowledge and workers to do that. And what do these markets look like? So, to be effective today, what do we need to know? What do we need to be able to understand? Well, I sat down and I seriously thought about this, and I said, here are the skills. If I were to teach anybody anything, if this is all you could learn, it has absolutely nothing to do with academics. It has to do with how to be a human being in society, how to set goals, how to sell, right? How to get over your bad self. There's a lot of different things. How to be civil, understanding of civics. But how to learn is really key among them. So we have to teach people how to learn. We have to teach them how to react in certain situations. I always find it very interesting, is once again, I have a child who's 21 and just graduated from college, and I'm thinking about okay, what is it you need to know now that you were never taught anywhere along the way, like how to buy a car, how to get a mortgage, how to do a lot of the things that we really need to do when we become adults and we have to take our responsibilities, but a lot of that information isn't provided to us as part of our secondary education. So when we think about education overall, how do we make this work? Well, one of the things I thought about is what do we not need to learn? What are the things we don't need to learn? And I think anything that we can easily research or look up. Now, we live in a world where we say, well, it's important. What happens if you don't have your smartphone with you? You can't look stuff up. All right, anybody here not have their smartphone with them? The thing is yes, if you get to a point where suddenly the satellites are all knocked out, you got bigger problems than remembering what you do. Is 7 times 856, or is that something else? So the thing about this is a lot of the stuff that I grew up with was about knowing it, putting it in your head, memorizing it. Yes, it's shorthand, it helps you. And I'm not really proud of this, but I'm at a point in my life where I'm not starting to remember my times tables very well because I really don't ever do it anymore. I pick up a calculator, I punch numbers in. And the good thing is I get the same answer every time I do that, whereas when I did it the old way, never the same answer. So I can look things up. I don't have to know everything. And I have such easy access to information now, and it's at my fingertips that it almost makes more sense for me to say, I need to know how to figure out how to ask the right question so I can find what I need. That's a better skill set for me than to just know all sorts of stuff. And the other thing, of course, is that when we look around us, when you're dealing with students, you start to realize very quickly that we're not all the same person. We have different ways of learning. And I sit down with some of my students, we run experiments, and we'll see if people are more visually learning, or auditory, or kinesthetic, or theoretical. I mean, just what's the best way to get information into your head? The answer to that question is it depends. It's different for all. Some people need hands-on, some people are perfectly happy, just having someone read it to them. So it's a very different process, but we're not the same person with the same aptitude and the same needs and the same interests. And this brings us to another problem, and that is, we oftentimes get put into this square peg, round hole kind of scenario where we're told that we're not good enough because we can't do the things that apparently we're supposed to do. And I love this quote. It was attributed to Albert Einstein, but apparently it's not something he actually said. But everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And I know in my own education, there are challenges, there are academic challenges that we all face that really have nothing to do with our areas of intellect or capability, but more with our capability to do those particular tasks. And I'm often reminded of the idea of intelligence or ability. A story of a friend of mine grew up dyslexic. And for people with dyslexia, he was much older, and it was not one of those things that they had much knowledge about when he was a child. So instead of being diagnosed as being learning disabled, he was just dumb, which really does not do an awful lot for his overall psyche. And of course, what happened is the relationship that he developed toward reading was not good. because reading was painful. Reading made him feel stupid, and he did not want to be a reader. Now, does this make him a dummy? Well, no, it really doesn't, because he was a very smart man in other ways, but he was also very kinesthetic. He's the kind of guy who could take a small engine apart and then put it back together again. It would work, and he wouldn't have parts left over, which I've never once in my life accomplished. So I look at that as a form of intelligence that's not being measured on the scales that we measure intelligence often in education. The idea of being able to read or the idea of being able to do mathematics really seems to be the culmination of absolutely everything that we are. And I disagree with that. How many of you were gifted, how many of you took algebra at some point in your life? All right, well, just about everyone. How many of you used algebra in, say, the last year for some of you? Okay, a few. So 100% of you took algebra, 5% of you actually still use it in some meaningful way. Which brings us to the question, how valuable is algebra? Now, I don't want to pick on algebra, although I'm going to pick on algebra a little bit. But I just put it out there, there's a skill set that someone decided along the way, we all need to learn this, even though oftentimes they never told us what to do with it. And this creates some huge challenges, because once again, knowledge that you don't know what to do with is not very useful, and it has a tendency to go out of your head. So we want to make sure that when we're exposing people to content, that we're thinking about how can this be used in the future? How do we apply what we're teaching you? Not just, hey, you might want to learn this someday, or you need to know this for the test, right? Because that's the kind of thing that often ends up happening. And it brings us to the question of, should we start to shove students down a path that's not theirs? Or should we help them find a path that is theirs and try to identify that somewhere along the way? So I want to tell you a story about math. Now, I was a horrible math student. And the reason I was a horrible math student is I realized by the time I made it to high school, my family had moved 10 times. I had been in 10 different schools. And math is a fairly linear process. And if you don't have a good background in it that's fairly stable, it becomes just a big mystery game. And for me, it was a mystery game, and it made me feel bad about myself because I didn't understand it. And of course, the report cards would always come home and say, well, I'm not sure what his problem is. He's obviously very smart. He's a very good reader. He's very good with language. He should be able to do math. Which I always said, well, that really just doesn't make any sense at all, because one does not equal the other. Okay, so you can be smart and not necessarily be math dominant or language dominant. And then you run into algebra somewhere along the way. And algebra was hard for a lot of people, and it didn't make us feel good about ourselves. I love this one personally. So there's a plenty of humor out there surrounding the fact that we all had to go through this, but we didn't get a chance to really define what the value was to us. So when I think about mathematics, and I have in the past, I think about what it's done to a lot of people who have not felt good about themselves going through it. And I ran across this great opinion several years ago in the New York Times. I don't know how many of you got a chance to read this when it came out. It was in the Sunday Times, and I gravitated to it. And it's very fascinating. A guy named Andrew Hacker, who, by the way, is one of us. He teaches at Queens College, wrote an opinion piece. And basically what he cited in his studies is that in 2012, 1 in 4 ninth graders failed to finish high school. And the reason they failed to finish high school was because of algebra. And during 2008-2009, South Carolina, 34% dropped out. That number in 2011 in Nevada was 45%. These are people who are in high school who just gave up because it got impossibly difficult for them. The challenge was they took algebra. They didn't do well at algebra. They went to summer school, which was punitive. Like, we're going to punish you and make you go to summer school to learn something that you had a hard time learning, and they didn't do well there. And eventually they said, you know what, enough of this. I'm going to go sell drugs on the street. It's a lot more fun and a lot more lucrative, but I don't have to learn algebra. So the challenge, of course, is that, all right, so we have this topic which we can agree upon from an educational standpoint is necessary for some, but now everyone's getting the same thing. And so a couple of years ago, he followed up his opinion piece with a book called The Math Method. And it's talking about how algebra is required as part of the new Common Core curriculum in 47 states and territories, but it's driving dropouts at all of these different levels. So he also cites the fact that public colleges, such as the ones that we represent, is most likely to require abstract algebra as a precondition for a degree in every field, including art and theater. Okay? And so my question is, why? Now, when I went to college, my degree was in television production. My degree was based upon the fact that I wanted to build media, create media when I grew older. And I found a wonderful loophole, and that was, in order to make sure I had all the math requirements required for graduation, I could take computer courses. So I took those. Because computers was not math. It was a very different place to be. And it was something I enjoyed immensely. We started to find things like in 2009, CUNY faculty reported they found that 57% failed the systems required algebra course. A subsequent study showed that when students were allowed to take a statistics class instead, only 44% of them failed. So, better, okay, not as many fail. But we have to ask ourselves the question, why do you need either if it's not something you're going to be able to do? Now, by the way, I don't want to say don't put this in front of people. Don't let them try. Don't make it hard. I think it should be challenging, but I think at some point we can start to identify where it's not resonating, where it's not working for them. And Hacker goes on to say, we're really destroying a tremendous amount of talent. People who can be talented in sports, writing, or being an emergency medical technician, but can't even get a community college degree because of these requirements that they can't pass. Now, why am I picking on algebra? Well, I'm picking on it because in a lot of ways, someone has made a decision that if you don't know this, you can't do these other things that are often unrelated, okay? You can't get an art degree because you're not really good at algebra. Doesn't always make sense. Now, something very interesting that happened with my son when he was in grade school is he didn't finish an assignment he needed to finish. And so the teacher said, well, you didn't finish that assignment on time, so you're not going to be able to go to art class. You're going to have to stay here and work on the assignment. And my wife said, so if he was late with his art project, would you make him not go to math class? And so he could work on that. And it was a very interesting question, and it took the teacher aback, and she's like, no, I don't think I would. Because the idea is, math is not supposed to be fun, but art is. So I'm going to take the fun thing away from you, make it punitive, and make you do something you don't really want to do. So there's some challenges. As I mentioned, as individuals, we have different core competencies, so what does that mean for us? Can we work toward our strengths? Can we identify the things that make us unique, that we're good at, that we like to do? And can we do the same thing to identify what makes us unique? So it's like trying to sell a product that not everybody wants, okay? You can pop it out there, but it's not necessarily something that everyone's going to want to put on their shelves or bring home and put in their fridge. So when we think about education, how can we turn it into something that's joyful and not punitive? And we've all seen examples where everything is just about punishment. And I've often said it makes no sense to me that we would test somebody on something, find out that they did poorly, and say, well, that's it, you're done. No. What we really need to think about is how do we create mechanisms that allow us to get the right information to the right people? In a lot of ways, that's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make sure that the education that we provide is viable. We don't want it to be, learn this because you might need it someday. We want it to be more like, learn this because it's important, because you can apply it, because there's something out there to do. So is education still important? It's really, really, really important. Okay? The last 24 hours may have shown us certain indications of the importance of education. But it's not about getting everybody the same message. It's about getting the right skills to the right people. Now, there are times when I like to collect things that make me laugh and sometimes cringe a little bit. And so every so often I'll find something that just, for example, does it rain in Australia? For those of you who can't read, me and my friend are having an argument. She says that it rains in Australia, but I say it can't because obviously the rain falls to the top of the world, but at the bottom of the world, it wouldn't fall to Earth, it would fall into space. Okay? We live in the 21st century. And somebody's still unclear on the idea of gravity. Guy explaining why he broke up with his girlfriend, she pointed up at a bluish star and sincerely asked, is that Earth? This woman here is very unhappy. Wow, I can't believe that Titanic sunk and the people filming it didn't even stop to help. It's rather heartless, isn't it? This woman wants her first daughter to be girls. So that's a good thing. How far is it to drive from Miami to Florida? All right, well. Different parts, I suppose. Somebody tried to tell me there was 50 states in America. Not because the scientists found out that Pluto don't exist. We got 49, dumbass. So it's a little bit of a mixed metaphor, but yeah, we need education. Because there's some people out there who are kind of poorly informed. And we need to make sure that, well, they don't communicate so loudly in places where other people can judge them like we do. But don't we all feel a little bit better about ourselves? Isn't this good? So it's cathartic. The challenge with education also is how long it sticks around. The vast majority of graduates lose so much of what they learn undergraduate and graduate level within just a few years. So there's a recent study that showed that basically 2/3 to 3/4 of knowledge was gone within 1 year. So you just spent $200,000 it's going to show up in 18 months. That's awesome. Where do I sign up for that? Now, we're going to learn a lot of things that we don't necessarily apply. We're going to learn a lot of things that are going to be in there somewhere, along with the song lyrics from 1970s hits that we totally forgot about, right? But we don't necessarily know what to do with this information other than have it. So being able to figure out how to take information and apply it and do something with it is really what we're looking at. Now, once again, getting back to my education, this is the kind of stuff that I work with. Okay? It looks pretty heavy duty. And right now, it's sitting in a Smithsonian exhibit somewhere, part of our exciting media past. Okay, so this is not useful information anymore. Even if I had it in my head, I can't do anything with it because time has marched on. So we need to think about what it is that people need and why they need it. This is a great clip from The Matrix. Some of you may remember, he needed to learn how to fight, so he basically jacked into this program that taught him all these martial arts programs very quickly. And later on, he jumped in and it taught him how to fly a helicopter, which would be really awesome, by the way. Yeah. I'll be right back. Okay, good, we're ready to go. Of course, it's not that easy, but wouldn't it be nice to be able to have access to the stuff we need when we need it and not have to just remember everything we've ever learned since birth, which apparently doesn't seem to work. So we want to be able to figure this stuff out. How is this going to work for us? Which brings us to another possible sacred cow, and that is, what's this educational degree thing all about? How useful is this? I know it's sacrilege to stand up in front of a bunch of educators and say, should we get degrees? Well, if you keep losing the information, you don't remember what it is, you spent a lot of money getting there, how useful is it? It may open a door, but you still have to be smart. So I often ask this question, if you were going to hire somebody, would you want someone who has a master's degree that's 30 years old, or do you want somebody who's been doing really relevant things within the last 5 years of their career? I think it's a pretty easy thing to choose from. And by the way, you can get a degree in something that has absolutely nothing to do with anything and still get a job teaching in the future. Like, you have a master's? Yes, I do. Here you go. Welcome on in. Okay? No, I'm sorry, you're a genius in so many ways, but we can't. A friend of mine was called by a small college in New Hampshire, and they said, well, we're just going to tell you we've adopted one of your books as one of our textbooks, and we noticed when we're doing the research that you actually don't live very far away from the campus. And we were wondering, would you be interested in teaching our program? And he's like, I actually would. I think it'd be very fascinating. He said, fantastic. Where'd you get your master's degree? He goes, I don't know. I'm one of those guys who writes lots of books and does lots of research. It's really smart, but I never went to school to have someone tell me what to do. And they're like, oh, really sorry, we can't hire you, but we're going to use your book. And it's one of those, okay, thank you, sort of, maybe, So, and I understand the need to have credentials. I understand the need for validity, but the challenge, of course, is that really comes down to the overall value of the content that you're using. What's in your head, and what are you doing? As we start thinking about higher degrees, and there's all these colleges out there, right? All of us are working to try to get a slice of that pie. But there are also companies out there like lynda.com, which will tell you lots and lots of stuff, really affordably. Khan Academy, which will do it for free. Lots of volunteers. You get the 24-hour MBA. I'm in the business. This is what I do. I try to get people to come in and learn things. And, so we end up with a lot of competition. We start looking at the degree program, and a lot of times we're getting people who are saying, I don't know, is this degree thing work? Is an MBA worth it? What's the ROI? If you go and spend $200,000 on an MBA, and you want to be an entrepreneur, does it pay for itself out? Right? Because it's not about opening the door and getting into that great job with McKinsey or whomever that will help you pay those bills back. It's about learning what you need to learn so that you can use that information to make a difference in the world. And we're starting to see a lot of questions about the degree programs and what people are doing, and finding out that people who have the great degree programs are not necessarily the best people for the job. Let me ask you a question. I don't mean to load this, but how many of you know someone who's really, really, really smart, like PhD level smart, but can't teach? Okay? But they're qualified. Oh, you want to teach? You have a PhD? Yes, come on in. Yeah, but I don't have the skills to actually take what's in my head and share it with somebody else. Okay? Not dumb, different skills. You'd much rather have someone who is actually eloquent and able to take the stage and say, hey, let me share with you something, even though I'm not as genius as this guy who studied a lot, I have some good insights as well. So anyway, not to pick on education, which we are kind of doing, but to just bring to light the fact that these are some real challenges. So what does all this mean for continuing ed, right? We're in a business where we're trying to help people. We're trying to empower people. We're trying to get them to a point where they can take the skills that we provide them, apply them to a real world situation. So they can use them to be better people, have better lives. And we're looking to re-empower some people. I've dealt with a lot of people over my career who are just totally retooling themselves. I just changed careers. I want to do this. The market seems really hot for it, so I'm taking this course so I can learn how to do this, so I get a job doing something new. This is totally unlike anything I've done the rest of my career. And so they're looking for skills for the future, and we have to think about what that means. Now, when we talked about math a little bit, interesting quote that came up very recently talking about many jobs requiring only mathematical skills have been automated. So the idea of being a mathematician, so you can sit around and do math, is not as viable as it used to be. But what we start to see is that math is still very important. And you can see very well in this chart. What we have is a breakdown. The pink dots are concepts that have fallen. Okay? These are jobs that are no longer as relevant as they used to be. And a lot of them over here, we have kind of those requiring great social skills and those requiring less social skills. We have laborers and welders and machine operators and janitors and auto mechanics and carpenters on one side. These are jobs that are being automated in a lot of cases, made a lot easier, prefab, whatever it is. And if we go up and to the right, we have financial planners. We have a lot of people who are working in analysis of different things. So they need math skills. But in order to be effective, they also need social skills. So this crossover between being really good at math and being really social doesn't sound like engineers to me. But a lot of what we're finding is that teaching people how to use their knowledge, but also combine it with other world skills, is really what's going to make them successful in the future. So a combination of their analytical skills and things like social skills. So what are we looking at in tomorrow's job market? Well, here's something that's a little almost horrifying. A company called TomorrowTodayGlobal.com predicts that nearly 25% of today's full-time employees will be working as on-demand people, based on an increasing preference of companies to hire freelancers for short contracts when the need arises instead of keeping people on staff. Now, I've been in this business for years. It's one of the things where I hire teams, put them together, and you need something. Hey, no overhead. You're not paying benefits. There's a whole bunch of things, ways you can save money in. And it also allows people who are really good at a skill set to just go and participate, provide that skill set. But it also means if you have 25% of the workforce out there is self-employed, then there are a lot of other skills they need to have, like bookkeeping, basic bookkeeping, being able to, manage meetings, being able to do a lot of the things that when you work for a large company that other people are taking care of. So this is going to be a very interesting transition of a lot of people who are going to have to learn how do I work for myself? How do I be a self-starter? How do I find business? So these people have to be in sales, they have to be in marketing, they have to understand different skill sets that they may not have working for a company. We start to look at new professions, things like being an urban farmer, or someone who cares for the seniors, or end-of-life planner, not a job I want personally, but it's very necessary. Okay, remote health care. So how about, the doctor doesn't actually come into town, you go into a center, and the doctor inspects you using, cameras and over audio, and gets a chance to give you, check your vitals, see how you're doing. You could also be a neuroimplant technician. A lot of technology coming our way that's going to be dealing with our brains directly. Someone who has to figure out how to keep your smart home up and running. Okay, so technicians to deal with that. People who are going to be dealing with Internet of Things on a regular basis, either as programmers or technicians, virtual reality experience designers. We all have these amazing phones now that can do all this augmented reality, things like that, but people are going to have to figure out how to make these programs work. We'll see things with 3D printing. The point I want to make is that there's a lot of new technology that's coming our way, and that's going to spark different economic needs. It's going to spark a need for different skill sets. And we need to be able to create infrastructure so that the people who need how to learn to do these things can get the information they need quickly and effectively. We don't want to necessarily say, here's a long drawn-out program for you. What we want to say is, this is what you need. Take this course or take these two courses and you'll have the understanding you need in order to jump into this type of field as it becomes more and more available. We want them just to have the knowledge to be able to start the conversation, to be able to walk in and say, I know what I'm doing here, and at least be able to develop those skills further and be able to walk the talk. So we need to get them from here to there, and I think continuing education is in a wonderful position to do that. Because if we're flexible enough, It allows us to go out there and say, okay, we have opportunities here. These are non-degree, you come on in, you learn the things you need to learn because it's relevant to you right now. So we're there to provide you with the services that you need and get you on your way. And so the information that's going to help them do a better job is what we're really focused on. And courses and programs that we can do that are going to not only help promote social skills, but cooperative learning and playing and planning and working. A lot of the things we didn't learn through our secondary education. I automatically build into all of my courses opportunities for my students to work together in diverse groups. I create every week, we randomly switch up a project and you don't know who your partner is going to be until your partner arrives. So groups of people will have to share ideas with one another. And what's even better for me at Baruch is a lot of these students are from very different places, very different cultures, different languages, and so they're always learning from one another in the process. So the education is not just me saying, here, I think this stuff is important, but the fact that you're interacting with each other and you're answering questions and you're asking questions is as important. And we want to make sure we can bring more of that. We want to give them real world skills so that when you go to a workplace and someone says, what do you think? Instead of going, I don't know, no one's ever asked me that question before. They can say, yes, here's my opinion. Let me share with you, and this is why I think this. Okay, and be able to defend what it is that they're doing. So we look at our own programs. How do they measure up? What is it that we offer that gives us some sort of unique selling proposition, gives us benefits? And are those benefits available and ready to see people who come in and peruse your catalog? Are they able to look at this and say, oh, I want this. I want to take this course. This is going to change my life. This is exciting. Or are they like, oh, that again. Oh, yeah, they do that too. You know. And yes, some of the sameness has to be there, but we also want to be put in a position that allows us to go and be unique. We want to stand out. We want to have something that makes us better from any other continuing ed program out there. Okay? Because we're also in competition with one another, aren't we? And so a lot of what starts with, of course, is defining what it is the people that we're trying to sell our products and services to really want. Okay, these are adults. We'll start there. What are their real world needs? Have we defined what they want? Have we defined what they need accurately enough so that they say, this is the program for me? And I would just suggest that we continually question absolutely everything we do. When we come up with a curriculum, why do we offer that course? Because we've offered for the last 4 years? No, but why? Why do we have that course? And who's it for? Who is that course for? And I mean that. Think about who it's for over and over again. Ask yourself all the time, who are we doing this for? What do we want them to walk away with? What do we want them to understand that they don't currently understand? How can we get them there as quickly as possible? And how is the world changing? How is their world changing? And what does this mean for them? We need to look for opportunities wherever we are. And one of the challenges I have when I create my own content is that I want to make it absolutely perfect. And what I've learned over time, and I love this quote from John Cage that says, begin anywhere. And if we can go out there and identify what it is that we think needs to happen and just start it. I'm going to offer this course to you. Guess what we're going to do next year? We're going to modify it. Because you're going to give me feedback. We're going to figure out what works and what doesn't work as well. And we're going to continue to evolve this thing forward. And it's going to change. It's an organic thing that's going to grow and thrive in a very different way. But we have to start somewhere. So let's start with a great idea and see what happens. We may pitch a course one semester and nobody loves it. All right, we did something wrong. What can we do to make things happen? So I want to help you think that, don't go into this saying, well, it's going to be 100% complete. I have never in my life had anything that's 100% complete. Because every time I do it, I say, well, if I did that again, I would do it differently. And I think you all are in the same situation. So start with being valuable. And think like a futurist. Ask yourself these questions. By the way, there's this thing called the Google. And if you go out there, you can ask them what's going on in education. So, top 10 trends driving marketing in 2007. Forecast, sales. There's all sorts of people out there who are spending time thinking about the future and what it's going to look like. Take advantage of their insights. You don't have to be a futurist to read these articles, but it's also going to spark some ideas. So if you work in a department and you're thinking, how can we make this more relevant? How can we make this more interesting to our students? How can we make this more valuable to them and their experiences in the workplace? Let's look down the road a bit. That might help us see from a completely different angle we've never seen before. Okay? We want to be proactive as much as possible, and so often we're reactive, And we just put out fires and like, oh, students are unhappy about this, let's go do this. But we can really just take some time and say, if we were going to start from scratch, let's say we didn't exist and we needed to exist, how would we do it? What would it look like if we just sat down one day and said, you know what, let's create a continuing education program for somebody. What is that going to look like? So let's figure this out. Right? By the way, one of the challenges with this in working in any organization, and by the way, I work in academia long enough to know that there might be a few egos out there. It's really hard sometimes when you get to work with a group. If you can check your egos at the door, it makes a big difference. And also to try to avoid the HIPPO. Anybody here familiar with what the HIPPO is? It stands for highest paid person's opinion. And while you may have somebody who you really need to look up to in certain ways, they may not be the expert that you are. So sometimes being able to say, I understand that you are the chancellor, and I'm not certainly disagreeing with anything you have to say. However, we've thought long and hard about this, and we think this is the best path to take. So, by the way, when you work in continuing ed, you have access to some of the best subject matter experts out there, okay? People like me, adjuncts. Ask them for help. Now, a lot of adjuncts have day jobs. They have other things that they're doing, but they're also educating because they love the process. And if you ask them for help, first of all, it's good for their egos, and it makes them want to belong. So if you say, we're thinking about starting a new program, and we're thinking along these lines, what do you think? Would you like to come in and sit down with other smart people and kind of just spend a couple hours talking about these ideas and see what you come away with? Yeah, they'll show up, okay? First of all, treating them with respect, that's something that usually doesn't happen, so they're really happy to have that happen. But one of the challenges, of course, and not saying anybody in this room, but when you're working with adjuncts, they don't like being treated like temps. They like to be part of the school. I don't work for Baruch College. I work at Baruch College, but I love working with the folks at Baruch College. And that's the difference. So ask them what's on their mind, and some of them will have good insights, some of them maybe not so much. But it allows you to change the entire fabric of what it is that you're doing with your groups of people and your educational pursuits. Also, talk to your current students. We run into this all the time. Don't make assumptions that just because you put it out there and they took a course that everything went fine. Okay? You might have to sit down with them and say, what did you like about this course? Okay, now here's the really hard question. What did you not like about this course? Which one do you think is more important to understand? How many of you have to go through an evaluation process on a regular basis for the students? Anybody here? How many of you realize that 2 glasses of wine beforehand is really the only way to do it? Oh, it's hard. It's so hard to be critiqued because I don't know of any teacher who's gone out and said, you know what, I'm going to phone this one in today. I don't really want to be here, but yeah, it's in my contract. No, that's not it. We're trying to do the best job. We stand in front of people and we say, I want to make a difference in your lives. And then you sit down through the evaluation, and sometimes you're like, what? Really? But we have to learn about what doesn't work as much as what does work. We can't just live with this grandiose idea that somehow we did everything right the first time, because we probably did. So we're going to learn over time from our mistakes. We're going to learn about our mistakes by honestly asking people to provide their feedback in a safe environment. Tell me what you like, tell me what you didn't like. How would you improve this course? Because you've just taken the course, you have insights into it. From that side of the desk, what would you do differently if you could be in charge? Overall, we want to be relevant and we want to be necessary with what we provide to the students who are out there. We want to offer them content that empowers them, changes their lives in some meaningful way. We want to think about the future. We want to be able to get out in front of them with messages that are going to resonate now and in the future and allow them to use those skills to get to another place. We need to constantly be looking forward. We can never rest on our laurels. Education will not allow us. Unless you are teaching Greek literature or some sort of 16th century European warfare, it's always changing. And you also need to think about who's in your classes and cater to their needs. Sometimes it means changing things up a little bit. And you sit down and you say, okay, it's a very different group of people this semester. Let me see what I can do to make it work better for these particular individuals. And I'm a big fan of experience before degrees. I'm not saying that we all have to go there, but certainly in continuing ed, we don't have to focus on degrees as much as finding the best people to help us do the job. And that's what I have for you. Thanks so much for your time today.
Sure. Yeah, we have about 5 minutes to questions. Spider? There has to be one good one out there.
Please, not all at once. Yes, sir.
Ladies first.
Okay.
I was just going to ask, tell me a little bit about emerging technologies that you have found that it's really important for folks to start learning about in continuing education, because I find that keeping up to date as to how to run business more efficiently through technology is a constant struggle that I face, because there's a lot out there.
Yeah, and then there's so much. You know, our joke in my industry is that just by the time you figure you've learned everything, it changes. You know, it's just everything, every acronym around the world is completely different. It's a great question, and one of the things that I'm seeing a trend toward is teaching everybody how to code. And I'm not saying necessarily everyone has to learn how to be a high-level programmer to understand the fundamentals of the logic structures that go into coding. For a couple of reasons. First of all, it's kind of almost like the new language of the future. Instead of saying everyone should learn English or literature, everyone should learn how to code because it's really where the jobs are going to be. But also builds up the skills that a lot of the mathematics we were dissing on are required. You know, it's just the idea of understanding how to create logic structures and how to create conditional statements and how to understand how to take a complex idea and break it down into smaller component parts and teach a machine how to think differently, I should say. That's an adverb. Thank you, Apple, for working. But you know, I think it's a situation where it empowers younger people, especially if it allows them to do something and make something that's really fun. My son, I taught him how to program when he was 13, and he said it was one of the best things that he ever learned in his entire life, because it allowed him to build things. It allowed him to, you know, you can sit around with Legos, and that's great, but you can also sit in front of a computer and say, what if? What if I do this? What happens if I change this code? And we're seeing that, of course, a lot of the things that are happening with a lot of the small computers and Arduinos and Raspberry Pi and a lot of those programming languages. The other thing I'll just mention is, because I think it's very important, that we're seeing a much stronger movement of young women going to coding, because, you know, somewhere the adage of girls who are, you know, men don't make passes and girls who wear glasses mentality from the 1950s is kind of stuck around in the fact that you can't be female and smart and do math at the same time, and that's obviously not the case. So being able to empower young women is something that coding is at. Sir? Yes?
Yeah, I want to go back to the $1 trillion problem.
Yeah.
So,
You want a piece of that?
well, you said $1 trillion, so you have
Yeah, $1 trillion problem in this country. Yeah.
So are those jobs, I think you had a 5-year timeline, are those jobs not being filled and there's no end in sight, or is there a plan to fill them?
It's a great question. So obviously sometimes the cart gets put before the horse, and sometimes the other way around. The challenge often happens is, you know, we have a new technology. Let's take Internet of Things as an example. You've all heard of Internet of Things. You may not necessarily know what it is, but you understand that basically that your appliances can be wired to behave differently, to be smart. One basic example of this is that Internet of Things, vending machine companies are able to put sensors in machines so they know what's in the machine. So if I have to go fill a machine, that's part of my job, instead of going on campus and walking into the vending machine going, oh, it's still full, I can actually look at a dashboard and go, that vending machine needs more Coke, that vending machine needs more you know, Snickers bars, or whatever it is. So it's just being able to use that technology to communicate in a different way. So we go out and we say, hey, we found a way to create these new opportunities, this new technology, but we don't really think about the infrastructure, you know, how do we maintain these things? What happens when the machine breaks down? Who comes and fixes the Internet of Things machine? Or who has to reboot it, or what happens? And the denial of service attack that happened last week, which I think some of you might be familiar with, which knocked the Internet out. Mm-hmm. That was all Internet of Things. Somebody hacked the Internet of Things devices because nobody had protected them. So we're learning all the time how to do things differently. But I think being able to help people understand that that's what the future looks like. You start to look at that technology and ask yourself the question, okay, if this is happening now, what comes next and who's going to help maintain these? So to get your question, a lot of it is going to be, you know, if I said right now, all right, I need to hire somebody who can help me fix my Internet of Things, you know, wired appliances. Does anyone know of anyone who has those skill sets? Okay. Most of us don't have a degree in that. So you're gonna have to find somebody who kind of hacked the knowledge together themselves, and more than someone who said, well, I studied it 4 years and I got a graduate degree in this thing that just started existing. So that doesn't happen. Time for one more? Yes? So kind of get them at the front end when they're younger. That was a great question. You know, I think partly being able to reach out. I mean, a lot of the teachers that I know who teach in secondary education would absolutely love to be able to have someone come in who has insights as to what takes place after school. I mean, education is so hard, especially for, you know, like a sixth grade teacher has all my sympathy because it's kind of like being in the middle of an assembly line. You never see the finished product. And so being able to work and, you know, have someone from a university come in and sit down with a group of, you know, students who are 12, 13, 15, whatever, and say, let's talk about the future, let's get inspired. You know, and the teachers may not have those insights, so they're not going to be the ones inspiring. So someone who can come in and say, we're looking at the future, and the future looks like this. You may change someone's life on that very day, just by that act of saying, this is what can happen, and have students totally think about their future very differently. So I think it'd be a great thing to do from an outreach standpoint. I have a feeling if you just reached out to almost any school, especially in the New York City area, and said, you know, can we come in and talk with your seventh graders about, you know, what's going on in future STEM, our you know, mathematics and engineering, et cetera, and what the needs are, you'd probably have them say, absolutely, please come in, because I'm sure they don't have the resources. Great, thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate it.